So, okay. Like I said, those pages aren't in any particular, well, they are kind of in order, but I've inserted things as usual. Turn to page 41. Well, actually, page 40 in that book if you have. Now, I'm going
to brought last time.
Bugging him.
Alright, okay. So anyways, if you go to that page, where we were on Saturday is at the Peculiar Institution, Fire Eaters, and the Freedmen's Bureau. That was 31 through 32. And I said, if you take that right there, 31, the Fire Eaters refers to...
Yes. The last two times that he's done it are on tape. The first time is... They're going to be like, what the heck is he moving out there?
Well, why don't you tell them? He's moving a camera.
He's moving a camera.
I don't hear a radio.
Alright, so anyway, like I said, we had worked our way up to the Peculiar Institution and the Fire Eaters, which took us right up to the Civil War. And then I think I was suggesting to you that, because of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, you do have this inclination that there might be something on the, something special on the test about that. And, in discussing the Civil War, what we did was kind of this. We kind of broke it into three phases. Phase number one was up through Antietam. And Antietam is September of 62. So, the war starts with the firing at Fort Sumter, and in the interest of time, we don't have a lot of time, to talk about that. But in the, the war starts with the firing on Sumter. Lincoln calls for troops. There is various fighting in the West and in the Eastern theater of the war. But it seems like the South's best opportunity to be successful in the Civil War is Antietam. It is September of 62. The South had successive victories, in the Second Battle of Bull Run, and had defended Richmond in the Peninsula Campaign, which had failed. And now Lee moved his army north into Maryland in September of 62, and there he has kind of a showdown with McClellan. Now, the significance of that battle is, one, that Lee is not necessarily successful. It is usually considered to be a bloody stalemate. It's probably, if you needed to know two battles in the Civil War, Antietam would be one of them, and certainly Gettysburg would be the other. In both cases, the reason that they are important is because they are pivotal turning points. Antietam is significant because, not only is it the high water mark of the Confederacy, its best opportunity of being successful. In the aftermath of Antietam, Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's a big question. The big question is why, why then? Why so reluctantly? Was Lincoln sort of forced into emancipation, or did he kind of willingly? Is this something that he wanted to happen all the time? I mean, remember we had that whole discussion about whether Lincoln deserves to be called the Great Emancipator or not. Were circumstances such? Did his generals push him? Did the African American slaves crossing into the day push him? Did the radical Republicans in Congress push him? Was he just sort of swept away by events and eventually sort of capitulates to emancipation, or does he sort of orchestrate it all the time? And, certainly we know this, that Lincoln, makes it clear from the outset of the war that the purpose of the war is to save the Union. Up until Antietam, clearly Lincoln believed that saving the Union meant not liberating the slaves. After Antietam, he is convinced that saving the Union only can be done by liberating the slaves. And that comes in the Greeley, the response to the Greeley letter. Remember, Lincoln has the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk drawer. He is waiting for a suitable victory. He had already announced to his cabinet that he was going to do this in the summer of 62. And then Greeley, Horace Greeley challenges him. You know, what are you doing? Why aren't you moving towards emancipation? And he responds, knowing that he's going to announce this, you know, after a suitable military victory, by saying, look, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do so. If I could, by freeing none of them, I would do so. What I do to save the Union. And, you know, but, he goes on to say, my desire is that all men are free. So in the aftermath of Antietam, he initiates the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is significant, right? This is certainly significant. And the Emancipation Proclamation only liberated slaves that were under the military control of the Union Army. So only those places that the Union Army liberated were those slaves free. And so this is you know, certainly controversial. Lincoln doesn't free any slaves in areas not in rebellion. The border states are not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. But remember, Lincoln didn't believe, nor did anybody believe, that the national government had the authority to liberate slaves anywhere. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a military action. You know, a confiscation of property, an elimination of a property, you know, sort of status based on the rebellion of these states, a military action. It wasn't even sort of sure that in the aftermath that the Supreme Court would confirm that. Now, eventually, what does kind of finally settle the issue of slavery? I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation liberates slaves in areas that are in rebellion and eventually liberated by the Union Army. But slavery in the United States is eliminated as a result of what? Go ahead, J.R.
13th Amendment.
The 13th Amendment, which is passed by both houses of Congress in January of 65. Right? In January of 65, the 13th Amendment is passed. And with the 13th Amendment, you have sort of going into term 32 there, now the Freedmen's Bureau. Because now you officially have 4 million liberated slaves. Former slaves who are now free. Now, the 13th Amendment made no accommodation for, you know, these people. You know, these people were just former slaves on plantations all over by January of 65, and then finally by April of 65, the decimated South. The South is destroyed in the Union war effort. Union armies roll through large swatches of Georgia, even in the coastal areas, in Tennessee, in Virginia. There is widespread destruction, and now there are 4 million liberated slaves, most of whom don't have any form of education, most of whom don't have any money, few of whom have any kind of tangible skills, and even if they did, there wasn't anybody to work for. And so the national government's response is term 32, the Freedmen's Bureau. This is February of 65, even before the war ended. And the purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to sort of attempt to assist the freedmen and the former Confederates in sort of forming relationships that were outside of slavery. You know, work relationships, to provide food, education, to begin the incorporation of the former slaves back into, or not back into, but into the country. Now, this Freedmen's Bureau and the response to the Freedmen's Bureau hints at the issue. The white South doesn't like it. They don't like the Freedmen's Bureau. They feel that the Freedmen's Bureau intrudes on what now is their business. Their business is the status and condition of the free slave. And although defeated, you know, the white South is going to sort of argue that although they were beaten, the conditions, the relations, the status of the former slaves is their business. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau portends to the issue of Reconstruction. How will the South be reconstructed? What role will the freed slaves play in it? And you have sort of these tensions in the North over that. You have the radical Reconstruction. Is there one name that you can associate with the radical, not radical Reconstruction, the radical Republicans? Is there one name that you can associate with the radical Republicans? Any name at all? Is there anything you can associate with the radical Republicans? Who are they? Who are the radical Republicans? Go ahead, Billy. Darn you, Lucy. He knows no radical Republicans or nothing of the radical Republicans. Do you, Lucy, know it? Kristen Hill knows something of the Radical
They
Republic.
like wanted to punish the Confederates.
Yes, well, they obviously were Republicans, right? But they were Republicans who had historically supported emancipation, detested sort of the aristocracy of the South, and wanted to kind of crush the political power, the economic sway of kind of the white ruling class. And so the Radical Republicans, want to enfranchise African Americans, have them participate in government, build a Republican Party in the South that was based on the black vote. Now, unfortunately for the Radicals, Lincoln dies and Johnson takes over. And Johnson, although, kind of bellicose in terms of his, opposition to the Confederacy, offers to the South a fairly lenient terms to reincorporation into the Union, and really demands very little of them, besides, accepting, that slavery is gone, of the status of African Americans. And the best example of kind of what the white South would do if left alone, without any kind of northern interference, is the Black Codes. Remember, Johnson took over in April of 65. Between April of 65 and December of 65, the ex-Confederate states reconstituted themselves. They wrote new constitutions, they elected new officers, and all of those states passed laws known as the Black Codes. Now, the Black Codes, relegated African Americans to second-class citizenship in the South, and was one of the reasons that in December of 65, when the white South, wanted to reincorporate themselves into the Union, that Congress refused to seat their delegation. Now, when Congress refuses to seat their delegation, then we know that Johnson and Congress gets into a battle that eventually, results in Johnson's impeachment, but failed conviction. Now, the term repudiate, the 34, is associated with this, because along the way, it was insisted that Congress, or that the South repudiate their debt. That they would not pay it. They would not acknowledge. Anybody that loaned money to the Confederacy would not be allowed to have it paid back. Now, after 68, well, actually in 67, but definitely in 68. In 67, a new Congress is seated, and that new Congress passes a series of Reconstruction Acts. The first Reconstruction Act, the second Reconstruction Act, the third Reconstruction Act. And those Reconstruction Acts set the stage for radical Reconstruction. Radical or Congressional Reconstruction. During radical or Congressional Reconstruction, a coalition in all of the Confederate states, a coalition of carpetbaggers, term 36, scallywags, term 35, and the freedmen, kind of intimated in term 32, controlled the state governments of the ex-Confederate states. So, what we said was that, look, for a 10-year period, for various times, for various lengths of time, all of the 10, except for Tennessee, ex-Confederate states were under the leadership of coalition governments that were made up of these three groups. Now, the carpetbaggers were Northerners who had come South to work, to live, to participate in government. The scallywags were white Southerners that supported these regimes, and the freed slaves were the former slaves. And remember, we said the remarkable thing about radical Reconstruction is that African Americans participated. They voted, right? They held office, up through lieutenant governor and speakers of legislature. There were 2 black senators, 14 members of the House of Representatives. So this is a fairly remarkable sort of circumstance. I should mention this, that the black vote, is confirmed with the 15th Amendment. Radical Reconstruction is confirmed with the 14th Amendment. So let's do them real quickly. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment conferred upon them citizenship and demanded of states to protect or to provide equal protection under the law for citizens of the United States. So the 14th Amendment was really the linchpin amendment that establishes radical Reconstruction. The 15th Amendment gives the slaves the vote. Right? So the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment made them citizens, the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. And with the 15th Amendment, African Americans voted and participated in government in the ex-Confederate States for a period of time, up to 1877. Throughout that time, there was resistance against radical Reconstruction embodied in the first Ku Klux Klan. When we reviewed for the last test, we talked about the second manifestation of the Klan in the 1920s. Many of you wrote about that. There were questions on the multiple choice about the we reviewed it. But remember, we said the first manifestation of the Ku Klux Klan was a vigilante organization that was committed to overthrowing radical rule. White Southerners who formed these kind of terrorist groups, they were a terrorist organization, right? That was committed to overturning radical rule in the South, and they were successful in doing so. By 1877, there were only 3 states still under radical rule, and those states capitulated to Democratic leadership in the aftermath of the election of 1876. Who was elected, incidentally, in 1876, and whose election, therefore, ended radical Reconstruction? Does anyone besides Anna and myself know? Oh, so Anna, you are saying in 1868 who was elected to the presidency?
Was it a Whig?
Well, let's go back. So Lincoln was elected to the presidency in 60, and then again re-elected in 64. He died in 65, did he not? When he died in 65, Johnson took over the presidency. In 68, when there was an election, who won? Yes?
Hayes?
No, not in 68. You answered the first question. Go ahead. Grant. Grant was elected in 68. He was re-elected in 72. In 76, who was elected?
Hayes.
Hayes. So Hayes is what party?
Republican?
Hayes was a Republican. Grant was a Republican. But remember, Hayes' election was, well, this will be really good, Alex. Who did he run against, Hayes? No one will get that. If you didn't even know Hayes, who did he run against? What's that?
Clay.
Oh, it's always a good guess. Clay. No, who? Yes? No, Brian. Tilden. He ran against Tilden. And Hayes, remember, there were 3 states still under radical rule. And, their election returns were in dispute. And eventually, in a backdoor deal, it was agreed that the Republicans would be allowed to count their votes for the election returns for those states in exchange for what? This is called, the Compromise of 77. Woo.
Didn't they have to pull out the troops from the
Yes. In return for Hayes agreeing to withdraw all Northern troops from the South in the aftermath of the election, called the Compromise of 77. The Compromise of 77 effectively ends Reconstruction. Tomorrow in class, we're going to kind of pick up with that. Tomorrow in class, we want to talk about the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. So we want to kind of trace the status of African Americans after the end of radical Reconstruction through the 1950s in the Eisenhower administration. But one thing that we can do is we can go to term 37. And term 37 would address some of the status of African Americans during this time period. Because we said in terms of black people in the post-Reconstruction United States, we said, A, most black people remained in former slave states. Incidentally, we said, look, 85%, if we go to the turn of the century, 85% of African Americans remained in former slave states. If we go up to 1910, the same would be true. If we go to 1920, that was changing. Right? There was something we called the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South to northern cities. What caused that to occur? I mean, we never talked about this in class, but you may have read about it in your book, and some of you wrote about it in your papers in the 1920s. What caused that to be true? What prompted I'll give you a hint. The great migration of African Americans out of the South into northern cities was beginning in 1970. Does that help you at all? 1970. Dylan, does that help you at all?
Because Jews left the North and jobs were.
Yes, wartime production. African Americans left the South in large numbers, and when they left the South, they left frequently sharecropping. And sharecropping was that arrangement where, the former plantations of the South were divided into small sections. The owners of those sections essentially leased those sections to African Americans and poor whites, and they paid for their lease not with money, but with a share of the crop that they grew. And remember, they borrowed from stores, often owned by plantation owners, with a share of the crop that they grew. And we said that sharecropping sounds reasonable and was the road for some African Americans to get out of poverty, but for most black people, they were perpetually in debt. So it's not surprising when there were opportunities to move to northern cities that black people took those opportunities during World War I and into World War II. Now, that created kind of the demographic that you saw really in the 1950s and the 1960s and even today, where in the South you have a rural black population, but in the North you don't. You don't have a rural black population. African Americans, when they left sharecropping, came to urban areas to work in factories, and there they stayed. And frequently, and this was a part of the suburban growth of the 1950s, white people fled. White flight, it was called. They fled to suburbia, and what you got was sections of cities that were highly populated by African Americans, surrounded by predominantly white suburbs in the north. Well, all right. Anyways, sharecropping is a significant thing about African Americans in that time period. Now, in addition to sort of the status of blacks, the movement of blacks, other things that are happening in the Gilded Age, and that picks up term 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. All of those kind of refer to this period of time between 1865 and 1900, a period of internal development that we call the Gilded Age. During that period, one of the things that was true was that the political situation at every level was corrupt and turbulent. We talked about the politics of the Gilded Age. We went through the presidents of those time periods, starting with Hayes. Then we went to Garfield being assassinated, Arthur taking over. From Arthur, we went to Grover Cleveland, and then from Grover Cleveland, we went to Benjamin Harrison, and then back to Cleveland, And so we talked about the lackluster presidents of the time, corruption at every level, during that time period. And we said to some extent that that there were issueless elections. Now, that did not mean that there weren't issues. There were. It just meant that the major parties didn't take firm positions on them. And one of the issues was currency. The issue of currency, what counts as money and how much money should be out there, had been there since Shays' Rebellion. I mean, the Shayites were agitating for easy money policies. And then we get in the Gilded Age, another agitation for easy money policies. And in particular, farmers agitated for easy money policies. And in the term 38, greenbacks refers to currency that was issued during the Civil War, not backed by gold or silver, that provided the government with funding that they would buy and pay debts. Agrarian interests that were looking to inflate the currency so that there would be inflation and would kind of make it easier to pay their debts and allow them to sell their products for more, advocated, greenbacks, as well as the free and unlimited coinage of silver. Right? The free and unlimited coinage of silver and the greenback movement were both ways that agrarian interests in particular sought to inflate currency and make it easier to pay back their debts. Now, what both parties kind of agreed with through most of this time was term number 39, laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire is an important term that you can apply kind of at any time. You know, laissez-faire means let them go, let it do, hands off. And for the most part, the business interests that dominated the Republican Party, or even influenced the Democratic Party, advocated that the government should stay out of the affairs of business, not regulate the economy during this time period, laissez-faire, let it go. The embodiment of that was, remember, Grover Cleveland vetoed the legislation that would have given seed to drought-stricken farmers in 1887, saying the government should support the people, or the people should support the government should not support the people, right? And so, eventually, it is going to be the agrarian interest, the populace, who challenge laissez-faire, right? You know, it's going to be the populace that are going to say, you know, look, we think the government should regulate, support, do certain things, protect. Now, in addition to sort of the battle over currency and the battle over the role of government, the other issue that emerged during the time period was that of labor. Now, we spent a lot of time on labor, right? Because I'm interested in that. You know, I'm interested in labor, the growth of labor unions, you know, during that time. Two you should probably be familiar with. The Knights of Labor, who was the leader? Not Gompers. Knights of Labor.
Gompers was AFL.
Terrence Powderly. Terrence Powderly was the leader of the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor is the kind of premier, at some point, labor organization that attempted to unify all workers in one gigantic labor party to pursue common labor interests. It eventually degenerates after the Haymarket Square riot, and the labor organization that emerges in the aftermath of the Haymarket Square riot and really exists to this day, of course, is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And their president, Murray, a longtime president, name that we associate with the AFL, of course, Murray was... there we go, Samuel Gompers. Jowsey, you knew that, did you not? You knew it was Samuel Gompers. Gompers had been the long time... Hey, what was significant about the AFL? What was significant about... Yes, go, Kristen.
Like they had like smaller like sub-unions of like your individual like skill.
Yes, they were organized by trade, by skill, and then all those skilled trade organizations were a big part of one organization, the AFL. It was called elite unionism. They made no attempt to organize everybody. The AFL is a group that was focused on improving the benefits for their membership, and their membership was confined to largely males that could do something. Now, their membership did grow, but they were not, didn't represent a widespread kind of labor party necessarily. And I'm not sure what kind of power they had over the great trusts of that time period. And if we would say the term Trust 41, what term would be synonymous with that? A trust is a form of monopoly. Right? The trust was a way for business interests to control competition. And of course, the most famous trust was Standard Oil of Ohio. And who created that trust, and do we associate with that trust? Go ahead, Alex.
Mellon?
Not Mellon.
Carnegie?
Not Carnegie.
Rockefeller?
John D. Rockefeller. And that's Standard Oil. We're in serious trouble. You know, I hope they don't ask any questions about... you kids actually don't remember this, right? There's a short guy, gray hair, was talking about it for days and days and days. Well, Elizabeth, you wouldn't remember, you were rarely there. But you know, some of the other kids that were actually there may remember that, yeah. So yes, we associate Rockefeller with oil, right? Refining oil. The Standard Oil of Ohio Trust controlled the refining capacity of the United States up to 90%, and it limited competition. Now, remember, the issue of trust, you know, and what to do about these business combinations these organizations that formed for the purpose of controlling competition and accumulated significant power and profits, really comes to a head in the Progressive Era. It's in the Progressive Era when people say, well, wait a minute. You've got these few trusts that control all of this economic activity, that are producing all of these products that are crucial to the existence of our lives, and they are unregulated, and they can potentially be abusive. For their pleasure and competition, they could do things that can ruin lives. And so remember, it was during the Progressive Era where the country said, we want you to do something about trust.